Howdy, y'all. Today, we're going to be looking at the job of the Victorian governess in Victorian-era Britain. Now, what is a governess? A governess is a private educator of children, and it's generally a live-in position. Governesses would be expected to educate children, look after them for most of the day, and also do any spare housework that might need doing. And it's exclusively a female job in this period. Men working in similar positions would be considered tutors. Now, the women who worked as governesses were generally middle class, educated, and unmarried, and it was one of the only jobs available to women in the middle class, because middle class women were generally expected to be married. They weren't really in a position where having a job would be an expectation. Now, what's the deal with the Victorian era? Why do governesses pop off so hard? In the Victorian era, there's an increase in demand for governesses because a lot of people were coming into new money and entering the middle class, and they wanted to cement their higher class status as opposed to the working class, and one of the ways of doing this would be to hire a governess. Governesses were believed to be able to impart a veneer of respectability onto the children of the middle class, and having some sort of education was considered important if for no other reason than signaling class position. There was also a massive increase in supply of women available to work as governesses. In this era, England was massively increasing its naval and maritime trade pursuits, which sent a lot of seamen out to sea. Because of this, there was a lack of eligible bachelors for women to marry, and if a middle-class family were to suffer financial downturn, then the women within that family would be unable to find a marriage as easily, but they would still have the education required to work as a governess. Now, one of the main issues with governess work is that in the Victorian era, you saw a massive decline in the salary of these women. While the increase in demand may lead one to think, hey, maybe wages should rise a little bit, there was such a massive increase in women available to work as governesses that average wages plummeted from anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds in 1800 to as low as 12 to 15 pounds in 1860. And because of the nature of governess work, it was incredibly difficult for these women to save up what little money they earned, because they were charged with providing educational materials for their students, and they had to maintain proper fashion for their position. Many of these women were also supporting family with their wages, so anything they could save up would be sent to their families instead of saved by them. These women were also paid far worse than men in similar positions. While the highest earning governesses in the Victorian period could get about £400 per year, that salary could be easily matched by an average male tutor. This position also would generally not see any severance pay, which is a serious issue because governess work was famously very insecure. Now, one of the issues is that there is a defined endpoint to a governess position. One cannot work as a governess indefinitely because a governess would typically be let go as soon as her pupils were of an age where they no longer needed her. There are some instances of people continuing to hire their governesses on after the children have grown up, but that's generally cases where they're hired on as companions, and they're very, very rare. This means that governesses who finish their position will have to go out and find a new one, but that becomes increasingly hard with age, because most people preferred having a young, chipper governess to an old, depressed governess. This meant that a lot of governesses, when they finished their position, would often be left destitute and forced to turn to the help of friends or even to the workhouses. Sexual encounters also threaten the governess's position. While governess novels often end with the governess marrying her employer, that would not be the case in real life. In real life, if a governess were to get pregnant by her employer, the governess would be fired, and the employer wouldn't face any consequences. A governess would also be at risk of being fired for any reason, because they had to comply with the parents' whims for educating the children. This dictated how a governess was able to perform her work. Governess work was also just very shitty for the governess, because the governess was rendered a social outcast. Every member of the family would hold the governess in poor regard. Men of the household didn't like governesses because they weren't supposed to flirt with them or fuck them, but they still had to deal with their presence sometimes, and that was very bothersome to them. Women found governesses dull and uninteresting, and house servants, who you might expect to have some sort of solidarity with the governess as they're both in a working position of the family, didn't really like governesses because they just copied the negative attitude of the parents. This was the same with the children. In all of her social interactions, a governess was inherently a social unequal. But just because governesses were little piss baby social pariahs in the eyes of their employers, didn't mean that they didn't participate in social events. And when governesses did have to engage in social interaction and attend social events, they were generally instructed to stay on the periphery. At parties, they would be instructed to stay on the sidelines and not engage in conversations. This is seen in a scene in Jane Eyre, where Jane is attending a party held by her employer, and she decides she'll find a nice chair off in the corner, and she'll sit there the whole night and not talk to anyone. At one point, her employer, who has the hots for her, asks if she wants to join in on their game, and she says, No, I shouldn't. And because of this, one of the other attendees says, "Oh, that's what I hate about governesses. They're so dull and stupid." Or something like that. I don't have the quote in front of me. So you can see sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy with the women finding governesses dull thing. If they were to go anywhere, the governess would be expected to follow behind or sit in the back of carriages. In Agnes Grey sits in the back of the carriage when the family goes to church, even though sitting there makes her sick every single time. She knows that her comfort is of so little value that she doesn't seem fit to bring it up. The mere presence of governesses is considered bothersome to everyone around them. And this social isolation of the governess is a new phenomenon of the Victorian period, because prior to the 1800s, governesses would interact with people. It's just that when the middle class started hiring on governesses, there arose a need to distinguish between them and their governess in terms of class standing, because even though the employers always had more money, from a social standing and cultural standpoint, the governess would often be arguably the higher class individual. By treating a governess like a social pariah and kicking her out of all events, middle-class employers could draw a very clear distinction. This is an underling, a worm, a little crab at my foot. All this social isolation put together meant that governess life was extremely lonely. They were cut off from public life and shunned in every aspect of their private life. And their jobs demanded that they be occupied with their pupils at almost all times. One governess wrote of how if she wanted to have any time for herself, she would need to wake up early, because there would be no time during the day that she'd be able to do anything for herself. And this gets all the more depressing when you consider that the governess had very limited prospects of social or economic improvement. They were often, as we said earlier, on a path towards the workhouses, towards destitution. And if you can't interact with anyone socially, you're not going to get into a high social standing. This left writing as the only outlet for many governesses, which is how we got these governess novels like Jane Eyre, Agnes Grey, and a whole host of others. And while it technically isn't a governess novel, Jane Austen's Emma is one book that I did read for this project, and I just want to put it out there. Awful fucking book. Like, could not will myself to care about a single fucking thing. Like, Jane Eyre, Agnes Grey, decent, fine books. It's not like I'm bored because it's Victorian style writing and it's just characters talking to each other. I'm fine with the books where characters just talk to each other. I don't know. I think it's just something about Jane Austen. Like, my mom wants me to read Pride and Prejudice, but I don't know if I'm going to touch that shit. Yeah, that's the end of the presentation. Also, on a design standpoint, I was using violets the whole time to like accentuate, because violets, if you don't know, are a symbol of sapphic love. And I use them because in the governess novels I read, holy shit, these women, they give such gay vibes at times, you know? I'm just saying. Yeah, in case you couldn't tell this was homework, thanks for watching.